Hello, and welcome back to another episode of From Alchemy to Atoms. I am your host, Dave Johnson, and it is good to be back. I think let's just start right off the top. It has been a while. It's been a solid 9 months since an episode of this podcast dropped. I really didn't intend it to go that way. That wasn't something that I had planned. Just a little background. I'm a college professor. I started this project last summer when I had loads of free time, and I fully intended to continue doing this project throughout the school year. However, you know, the schoolwork as well as personal stuff just really took up the majority of my time, and I found it wasn't possible to continue doing this at the level it needs to be done while also making sure all of those other parts of my life were those needs were being met. So this had to fall by the wayside, but I'm hoping to continue more with that this summer. So hopefully you'll have several more episodes to look forward to, and hopefully I'll have maybe a slightly better plan. If there is going to be a hiatus, or if there's going to be some other way of kind of managing this on like a seasonal basis. But regardless, I'm hoping to have some new really cool stuff out for you over the summer. So I'm going to kind of just pick up where we left off. This is the episode that I had planned to record. That was the next in the series. So I guess this episode 6, is going to be a pretty special episode. First, I think it's going to be, I guess, maybe the first episode of the second season of From Alchemy to Atoms, and also because it's going to be our first episode that focuses almost entirely on a single person. So today we're going to be talking about Galen. So Galen lived from 129 AD to 216 AD. So Galen, this is going to be a really nice episode because, a lot of times I've been telling you that we don't know a lot about the personal life of many of the people that we've talked about. That's not true. So for Galen, we know a lot more about him, his personal life. He was a prolific writer, and we have a pretty good idea of what his life was like. So there'll be a lot to talk about. So let's start at the beginning. So Galen, in his time was known either as Aelius or Claudius Galenus. And now we almost exclusively know him by his anglicized name of Galen. All right. We're not sure whether it was Aelius or Claudius, but what we do know is that Galen was a prolific physician, a surgeon, and a philosopher. And when you kind of think about taking all of those things and putting them together, being a doctor and a philosopher, I'm hoping you're starting to remember some of our earlier episodes, that this is kind of the way a lot of the ancient Greek thinkers were. They were polymaths. They were able to do lots of different things very, very well. And if you're thinking like, hey, we're in Rome, this guy's kind of Greek. Well, you'd actually be kind of right, because the part of the Roman Empire that Galen was from was very Greek culturally. Okay. So he was born in the ancient city of Pergamon, which is now the site of the modern city of Bergama in Turkey. Okay. During Galen's time, though, this part of the world was referred to as Asia Minor. And despite the fact that the Roman Empire, technically, like that this region was part of the Roman Empire, culturally, this region of the world was Greek. So they still subscribed to a lot of the Greek ideas and the Greek philosophies, and they took that overall approach to life. So Galen was the son of Aelius Nicon, and Aelius Nicon was an architect. But he was also interested in many other fields. So you may recall from a prior episode that in Rome, being an architect wasn't sufficient to just know like the mechanical engineering aspect of architecture. You were also expected to be knowledgeable in lots of other areas involved in terms of the culture and all that. And that was supposed to be reflected in your architecture and contribute to the cultural aesthetics of the Roman Empire. So in addition to being an architect, Aelius Nicon was interested in the fields of mathematics, philosophy, astronomy, and literature. And he truly believed in the power of knowledge. And therefore, when he had a son, it was important to him that his son had the best education possible. And Aelius took a very strong interest in his education. He actually, in his earlier days, Galen was tutored by his father at home. He wanted Galen to become a philosopher or a politician. And because it's kind of hard to picture this, but if you go back to that period of time, in particular in a culturally Greek area of the world, being a politician or being a philosopher was really sort of like the primo position to be in. It was what you wanted your children to do, because you were either contributing to our understanding of the universe, or you were contributing to to your nation state. You were a politician helping to lead your people, and as such, he thought it was really important that his son had a very, very strong background in classical philosophy. So, as a child, Galen is exposed to many of the major philosophical schools of the time. So you've got Stoicism is a big one that's happening there. You've got Platonism, so people that are kind of reinstituting the Platonic concept of the universe. Aristotelianism was still very big at that time. He also gets introduced to Pyrrhonism. This is actually named after a Greek philosopher named Pyrrho. It's not spelled pyro like pyromaniac. It's spelled differently. But this really is one of the schools of skepticism, which preach the idea of resist dogma, question everything. And then there was also Epicureanism, which we've also spoken about. So, as Galen's coming up as a child, he's getting very well versed in many, many, many different ways of viewing the universe. And despite his father's wishes for him to become either a politician, a philosopher, or something along those paths, Elias Nikon is actually visited one night in a dream by the Greek god of healing, whose name was Asclepius. And instead, Asclepius had told Elias Nikon, you need to encourage your son to study medicine. And very shortly after that, Galen gets enrolled at the Asclepion in Pergamon. All right, so let's talk about what that looks like. So at the age of 16, Galen's going to begin his medical training at the Asclepion of Pergamon, and this is kind of a big deal. So Asclepia were healing temples. So they were found throughout the Roman world. They were also found prior to that throughout the Greek world. You kind of got to picture them like spas, like people that are suffering from pretty much anything would come to these places. They would consult with the priests, and then the priests would help prescribe some type of treatment that would cure them or help alleviate the pain or whatever's associated with their particular malady. But the Asclepion at Pergamon was one of the best in the world. Like, they're way out in Turkey, and people are traveling from the city of Rome all the way out there just to go to this Asclepion, right? That's how, this is like him getting like an internship at the Mayo Clinic or, Cedar Sinai, one of the, big medical, or the Cleveland Clinic, right? So one of these big, like really high end hospitals. And here he comes as a 16-year-old to begin learning about medicine. Unfortunately, just you can tell just from the story so far how heavily involved Galen's father was in his life. But at the age of 19, fairly young, Elias Nikon dies. Okay, now Nikon was a pretty prominent person in his own right, and was a successful architect and had built a small fortune essentially. Had accumulated a small fortune throughout his life. And at the age of 19, upon his father's death, Galen now finds himself independently wealthy. So he's a 19-year-old that just inherited a pretty substantial fortune, and now needs to decide what he wants to do with that. So he spent the last 3 years or so learning medicine at the Asclepion in Pergamon. His father passes away, leaves him this huge chunk of money, and Galen's got to figure out what he wants to do. And what he decides to do with his newfound wealth is basically tour the world and learn as much as he can about the field of medicine. And this is actually something that he probably would have felt encouraged to do through what he was learning at the Asclepion and Pergamon. So they built off the teachings of Hippocrates. And Hippocrates, you probably have heard of the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. That comes from his teachings. But Hippocrates also encouraged his followers to travel and expose themselves to new ideas. He was someone that believed that, gaining a wide diversity of ideas is going to help you be more educated and help you be a better doctor, even though his version of medicine isn't what we would really consider medicine by today's standards. Okay. And obviously this period of time would have been challenging for Galen because he lost his father, which he was very close with, and he actually writes in one of his manuscripts, "The Diagnosis and Cure of the Soul's Passions." He has this little passage that kind of describes his relationship with his parents, which is kind of neat. I mean, we've met some people who we don't even know like what their actual name was, and here we're getting some insight into like what it was like growing up as a kid from Galen. So here's what he says. He said, "But I did enjoy the good fortune of having the least irascible, the most just, the most devoted and kindest of fathers. My mother, however, was so very prone to anger that sometimes she bit her handmaids. She constantly shrieked at my father and fought with him, more than Xanthippe did with Socrates. When I compared my father's noble deeds with the disgraceful passions of my mother, I decided to embrace and love his deeds and to flee and hate her passions. Just as in these respects I saw the utter difference between my parents, so also did I see it in the fact that my father seemed never to be grieved over any loss, whereas my mother was vexed over the smallest things." So you can see that Galen wants to live up to some standards that his father's created for him. He wants to make his father proud, most likely, because he's kind of grown up trying to emulate his father. And Galen spent the next 3 years of his life touring pretty much the majority of the known world. I mean, he's going to travel to Smyrna, he's going to travel to Corinth, he's going to go to the island of Crete, the island of Cyprus, and then eventually he's going to end up in the city that we've talked about more than any other city in this podcast so far. He's going to end up in Alexandria, right? Like, because that's where you went back then. Alexandria was, the intellectual seat of the world. And throughout all of his travels around the Mediterranean, to some of the islands in the Mediterranean, he is exposed to just so many different ideas and thoughts about the best ways to identify, to treat, to cure various maladies and diseases. Remember, back then, the dissemination of information was pretty challenging. It wasn't easy. Like if you had some cool new way of curing this disease, the odds of you sharing that with anybody that wasn't on your island or that wasn't in your immediate vicinity was probably pretty small. So when you have somebody like Galen who's literally traveling around to all these places, he's able to accumulate all of this knowledge and fuse that together to help inform his particular medical practices. And because he traveled more than anybody, he was exposed more than anybody, he's going to obviously have more knowledge than anybody, and that's going to make him a pretty amazing physician. So if we kind of looked at the way Galen approached medicine, modern times we would probably refer to him as an anatomist. He really believed that in order to treat somebody medically, like for us as like a species to learn how to perform medical treatments, we need to know everything that we can about human anatomy. We need to know how things are connected, how they work, how things, how our organs work together and all that sort of stuff. But there's one real problem that Galen's going to have. So the way modern medical students learn about a lot of anatomy is by dissections, and in some cases, the dissection of human corpses. Roman law prohibited this. So Galen wasn't able to study the human body directly and instead had to do a lot of his research on animals. He was actually pretty favored towards primates. The main reason being he recognized that primates had the most similar, at least superficial anatomy to humans. So again, if we fast forward to an episode probably a multi-part episode on Charles Darwin. Darwin's going to point that humans' nearest ancestors on the planet Earth are the primates. You have Galen saying this 1700 years beforehand. Obviously, I'm not saying that Galen had any ideas about evolution, but like the fact that it was that recognizable this early on in science is pretty remarkable to me. So he does most of his research on animals. He really likes to use primates, but he'll use all kinds of animals in experiments. And he did some really crazy stuff. I think, obviously we're, so many years removed from this, but like some of his experiments were wacky as hell. And some of them were really kind of fucked up. So here's an example of a wacky one. He was trying to demonstrate how lungs work, how lungs inflate. So he takes the lungs out of a dead animal. I'm not actually sure what animal it was. And he takes bellows and like jams them into the trachea. And if you know what bellows are, they look like this little accordion thing that you squeeze up and down and air comes out. And they're usually used to like stoke a fire. And he's trying to show people how lungs inflate by like pressing the bellows and tries to inflate the lungs. And I guess that particular experiment was a failure. I don't know why it failed. Maybe he pressed too hard and he collapsed the lungs. I don't know. But yeah, so that's like one of his like wacky, like, let's see how this works, and just tries to blow air into his like, this is how lungs are supposed to work. But he also did some things that would be considered pretty horrific by today's standards. So, you know what a dissection is? A dissection is when an animal is dead and then you cut it open and look at the parts. He also performed vivisections. So vivisections are different from dissections in the fact that the animal is alive while it's being dissected, which, yeah, I mean, obviously not something that, and he's doing this obviously without anesthetic or anything like that. So like, just, I don't know. I mean, you really gotta want to learn something if that's what you're willing to do. But he would do these things because there was his really only way to directly observe physiology. So, he would do all kinds of stuff, and we'll talk about some of the things that he learned from doing these. But yeah, I mean, he had to do some pretty gruesome things in order to learn what he learned. But I mean, I guess putting the cruelty of this aside, which I understand is hard to do, he was doing what he could at his time to learn things that we can learn better now because of modern techniques. So, obviously what you can see is he clearly wants to know as much as he possibly can about how living things work. And out of that, he comes up with some pretty ingenious concepts that nobody had thought of. So he's actually the first person to propose the existence of a circulatory system. One of the things that helped him with this was during some of these physiological, I don't, if you look at, doing dissections, doing vivisections, you can see that there's a distinct difference between arterial and venous blood, right? The blood that comes from your arteries. So for those that who aren't aware, arterial blood is blood that has been oxygenated and is on its way to the tissues. So it's like leaving the heart through the lungs and then back through the heart and out. Venous blood is the return. So this is the blood that is usually depleted of oxygen, is being returned to the heart to get pumped through the lungs again so that it can get new oxygen added on and carbon dioxide gets released. So he looks at those and there is a distinct difference there. That's why if you look at, you can tell that the blood actually changes color, believe it or not. And he was the first person to record that observation. He's also the first person to propose the idea that veins and arteries actually carry blood. The current belief at that time was that they were tubes that carried air. He actually, as part of his design of his circulatory system, he correctly proposed that air entered the body through the lungs, and that somehow the air got added into the blood, and that's how air gets distributed. So like he adds that they're not these hollow pipes that just move air in and out. They're filled with blood, and the blood absorbs that air, and somehow the blood transports that through the body. What he gets wrong there is he actually thought that the process of adding the oxygen to the blood was done in the heart. It's actually done in the lungs. So he gets that wrong. He also got some other things wrong about it. So he believed that venous blood was created in the liver, arterial blood was made in the heart, and that both were distributed through the body and like absorbed by the tissue, and then the liver would just regenerate new blood. So that's obviously wrongheaded, but again, like we can't judge this too harshly. Like he first he's like blood's a thing, and it goes through our veins and our arteries, and that's what transports the air around. He gets a lot of the connections right. In fact, another thing he actually gets right is his under his like understanding of the circulatory system, the food that we eat gets absorbed in the intestines, gets transported to the liver, and then the liver adds it to the bloodstream. That's actually correct. That is the way the majority of nutrients enter our body, or absorbed by our body, is through that pathway. So he gets that right. So very keen observations, and just some really amazing medical advances that he's making at this point through just the way he's learning and the way he's taking on information and the experiments that he's performing. So let's continue on his life. In 157 AD, so after traveling around the world, he actually comes back to his hometown. He comes back to Pergamon, and he actually applies to become the physician to the gladiators of the high priest of Asia. Now, there's some things that we have to think about in that sentence. So first off, the high priest of Asia. Yes, that was like a leadership position. It was maybe like a governor type deal. So this person was a very wealthy, very powerful person. All right. Now you're thinking, why does he have gladiators and why do they need doctors? Well, I think to understand that we need to learn a little bit more about gladiators. And this is a situation where I learned a lot about gladiators that I did not know before learning about the stuff for this particular episode. So let's learn together here. So if you are like me, up until I researched this episode, you have this impression about gladiators that is largely going to be based in cinema. It's going to be based in the Gladiator movie. It's going to be based on things like Spartacus. And you have this concept that all gladiatorial combat was to the death. And that actually isn't true. So in large part, it depends on which period of the Roman Empire you're talking about. So if you're talking early on, so like 0, 100 AD, like that early on, you're probably right. The fights were to the death. But by the time we get to the 2nd century AD, gladiatorial combat has become a lot tamer. And the main reason why is it was getting super popular. Okay. So instead of having this thing where you get these gladiators that go until somebody kills them, the fights actually they just added rules to them. So many of the fights would end if one just simply tapped out. They could just surrender and say, yeah, you would have killed me. Or if one of the combatants gets injured, like just cannot continue the fight, the referee would step in and say, fight's over, right? So it's stopped being like to the death and become more a bit like UFC, right? The referees were there to ensure that the rules of combat were being followed. So now there are rules. Like, this was blowing my mind as I'm learning about this, that there are actually rules to being a gladiator. Like, you can't do that. Like, I thought we were fighting to the death. Yeah, but you can't fight that way. So the other thing is, while many gladiators were in fact slaves, I just kind of assumed that they all were. As the fights became more regulated, there were free men that would actually step up and volunteer to be gladiators because it was a way of gaining fame and gaining money. So eventually it became big business. And people like the high priest of Asia would just have these stables of fighters. And they would host events using their fighters, or at some point, at certain times, they would rent out or sell, like basically trade them. I'm going to trade you. You're getting traded to another priest. You're getting traded to another whoever that needs a gladiator for this. But if you were borrowing somebody's gladiator and they happened to die in the fight that you had them in, well, then you had to pay the guy because you just destroyed his property, essentially. So this was like another additional incentive to keep the fighters alive and well. So Galen is applying for the job of patching up gladiators after gladiatorial combat, which is pretty amazing. And I'm going to also tell you the story of how he gets hired, but I'm going to do that after we talk about what happens while he does this. So Galen gets hired, and he spends 4 years basically tending to the wounds of the gladiators that belong to the high priest of Asia. He loves this job, loves it. And here's why. He's learning a whole new side of medicine. So first off, he's fascinated by just like their whole routine. These guys are athletes. They need to be in the best possible shape. So these guys, they were fit as all get out, right? They had routines to stay fit. They were very, very particular about their nutrition. They were very particular about their hygiene to prevent infections. They exhibited lots of preventative care. So he's looking at like kind of a proactive approach to medicine, which is really neat and novel. He's also fascinated by the fact that these guys get ripped apart during gladiatorial combat. So these guys suffer all kinds of traumatic wounds, okay? And to Galen, these were, in his words, windows into the body. Because when some dude comes in with like a compound femur fracture, he gets to basically see a partial dissection in a living human being. So he gets to see how all the body parts are connected, which he can't do because you can't vivisect a human, and Roman law forbids you from dissecting a human after they've died. So through all of this, he learns to repair damage to tissues. He learns to set broken bones. He learns how to staunch severe bleeding. He's basically learning how to become a trauma surgeon. So he's done all this learning. He's wandered around the world for almost a decade, learns everything he can. That's after leaving one of the most prestigious schools of medicine, essentially, the Asclepion of Pergamon, for the first 3 years of his training. And now he's basically doing like a trauma residency where he's just becoming a trauma surgeon for this. And he was really good at it. So in his tenure there, in those 4 years, he only lost 5 fighters. Based on what I read, the guy before him lost 60. So they were pretty happy to have him. At least if you were a gladiator, you had a pretty good odds of not dying if Galen was your physician. If you somehow survived the dude before him, where everybody who got injured died. So, but before we end his tenure here, I got to tell you how he gets the job. It's insane. All right, so this is the legend around it. I don't know if it's true. This is the legend around it. The legend says that there's a bunch of people that are like kind of interviewing for this job. So they go to the high priest and they're like, yeah, I heard you need a new physician for your gladiators. We're all here to apply for the job. Galen shows up with an ape, like just brought an ape with him. And he just walks the ape out in the middle of everyone and just eviscerates it. Just takes a sword and just slices the abdomen of this ape open so that its guts are just hanging out, falling over the floor. And Galen goes, okay, who wants to fix this? Come on, who wants to come up and fix this ape? And nobody would do it. So Galen then just proceeds to go about doing the surgery himself, fixing the ape back up, and then at that point, the priest is like, yeah, I mean, it's got to be you, right? Like, I can't fathom what HR would say in any job site nowadays if you try to get hired by eviscerating an ape. But for Galen, that's apparently how he got that job. That's a crazy story that I just had to tell you about, even though it's not as pertinent as it needs to be to the story, but it is wonderful. So he does this job for a little over 4 years. And in 162 AD, he sets out for the city of Rome. So he's going to the capital now. And he quickly sets about making himself 0 friends among the medical practitioners that live in Rome. They hate him. And the reason why is that Galen was practicing almost like some derivation of modern medicine. And they did not. So they were relying on supernatural, right? So they have these Asclepia where like when you come in, they're going to talk to the gods on your behalf and the gods are going to give them some sort of vision or some sort of guidance. And then they're going to come up with a treatment plan and you'll either get cured or you'll die. Galen, on the other hand, looks at your signs. He looks at your symptoms. He kind of cross references that with past cases that he has and said, oh yeah, the last time I saw somebody that do this, I did this and they got better. Or they did this and they got worse, so we're not going to do this. You know, like a doctor should do. Like he just decides to be a doctor. And that's one thing. It's also another thing that he kind of went about criticizing his colleagues in public. So he was not afraid to just kind of get out there and be like, don't go to those guys because they're just speaking to spirits and you're just as likely to die as to not die. You can come to me though, like I'm successful at treating people. And to be fair, there were people like in the city of Rome that were on his side. Like, I mean, he made a name for himself. The problem is at the same time he's making a name for himself, he's doing it at the expense of the old guard, and they're out in public attacking him essentially for calling him a heretic, right? And the idea of this is to sort of discredit his style, discredit him, thereby discrediting his style of medicine. But Galen didn't lay down. He's obviously, I mean, a guy who eviscerates an ape on a job interview isn't just going to like be like, oh, don't say bad things about me. So he fights back and he publicly defends his approach to medicine, stating in order to diagnose, one must observe and reason. Like, I mean, it's pretty easy to figure out whose side we should be on this. We're on Galen's side. And it's also worth stating that his talent as a physician had brought him into some very powerful circles within the city, including some people who actually had the ear of the emperor at the time. So that's Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Now, despite the fact that he has some friends, despite the fact that there's good evidence to suggest that Galen was a fantastic physician, his opponents, sort of the old guard of the medical world there, he was an existential threat to them. That's how they viewed him. They viewed him as an existential threat, and he was an existential threat to the status quo, right? I think today we would call him a disruptor. I think that would be the term. So Galen was a disruptor in Rome at this time, and he actually, like, some of his friends were coming to me like, you got to be careful, man. He's like, they might just try to assassinate you. Like, it's Rome. Assassinations were a thing, and there was actually a physician that had come to Rome just like him before, that had, you know, sort of a similar approach, that was a disruptor, shaking things up, and they basically poisoned him and like 3 of his assistants. That's how they just got rid of him. So like him and 2 of his servants died because they just poisoned him, because they're like, yeah, you're kind of a problem. So Galen in 166 AD, after a few years in Rome, despite the fact that like it's going kind of well, he heads home to Pergamon. He leaves. In his own words, he said he left Rome like a runaway slave. Those were the exact words that he used, basically implying that he snuck out. He didn't make a big fanfare of it. He just kind of slipped out the back door one day and just went back home. And there were a few reasons for this. One of them obviously was he was afraid. Like, there were enough people who know enough telling him that like something bad's going to happen if you stick around too much longer. So he was afraid of being banished, or, you know, worse, being poisoned like that dude before him by the more traditional physicians in the city of Rome. But there was also another reason. So Rome, the Roman Empire, was massive at this time. It's absolutely enormous. And even by modern standards, it's a huge empire. And because it's so big, and because its borders touch so many different peoples, Rome was almost constantly at war on multiple fronts. They were constantly fighting along their borders with Germanic peoples and you know, the Celts, and all kinds of different like cultures are just kind of on the outer edges of the Roman Empire. And during this particular time, the Romans were involved in a long series of wars with a group of Germanic people called the Macromani. So this is on their northern border. Think modern day Germany, modern day France. That's where these people are from. And the Roman troops were, as you would expect, commanded by their emperor, Marcus Aurelius. Now, at the time, Rome actually had 2 emperors. So Marcus Aurelius became emperor, and then he also named his adopted brother, Lucius Verus, as his co-emperor. And both of these guys are in charge of the Roman army that is getting ready to go into battle with the Macromani. Okay. He doesn't want to get conscripted into a wartime situation. He doesn't want to go to the front. So he figures, if I just kind of sneak out of the city and I'm just not there, he can't ask me, and then I'm not going to go spend like 8 years on the borders, the outlands of the Roman Empire fighting against, Germanic peoples. I don't want to do that, right? But something interesting happens in the winter that spans the year 165 and 166. So at this point, Lucius Verus's army is over in Seleucia. That's near modern day Baghdad, by the way. His army starts developing signs and symptoms of a severe illness, and it absolutely devastates it. This disease then actually spreads as they kind of make their way back towards Rome, and soon it would spread through the legions throughout the territories of Gaul, which is modern day France, and then along the Rhine River, which is the border between modern day France and modern day Germany, and then eventually it would make its way back to Rome itself. So according to historical reports, at some point after he's returned home to Pergamon, he makes it back to Rome. And he makes it back to Rome in the year one. He's at least there in 168 when the plague reaches the city. Shortly thereafter, Galen is offered a position of court physician. So this is the position that he was trying to avoid when he fled the city 2 years ago. And he gets offered this position, and he's called to the military encampment of Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, which is up in Aquileia. So this is in northern Italy. So this is kind of like their staging ground. It's kind of where the battle is going on with those Germanic peoples at this point. Okay. So Galen is really concerned that he's going to get trapped in this prolonged military campaign, and then that would keep him away from Rome. It's not where he wants to be. And he actually considers turning it down. I mean, which the stones to tell the emperor thanks but no thanks is pretty profound, but he doesn't do it. In the end, he acquiesces and he heads north and he joins the emperors. This is actually where he meets them for the first time. He just meets them at their military camp. In his own words, when he arrived, he had found that two things had preceded him. One was his reputation, and the other was the plague. This plague that had been brought over, that first showed up in the army when they were over in modern day Baghdad. Okay, he writes, "When I reached Aquileia, the plague descended as never before, so that the emperors immediately fled to Rome with a few soldiers." In 169, so shortly after they flee from the plague, Lucius Verus actually dies. He dies from the plague, and his brother, who obviously mourns, his brother's the loss of Lucius Verus, that can't deter him from the fact that there's still a war that's happening in the northern portion of his empire. So despite the death of his brother, despite all the stuff with the plague, Marcus Aurelius needs to head back to the front, and he needs to carry on the fight against the Macromani. So he leaves. And one of the things he does before he goes is he's like, Galen, you've got to come with me. I need you up there. You got to come help. One thing that I read, and I don't know what the actual truth is of this, so I'll just give you both outcomes. Galen, some people have expressed the idea that Galen wasn't sure whether he was going to go to be like Marcus Aurelius's physician or whether he was just going to essentially be treating wounded soldiers. And I think if there was any sort of like this is up in the air, Galen was like, I don't want to go and just become a field surgeon. Like I could do more back here. So actually what ends up happening is he doesn't go, and here's why. He reports to Marcus Aurelius that he had a dream, and in that dream, Asclepius, who had come to his father several years before, came to him, and Asclepius said that he was against the idea of Galen leaving Rome. And whether it was true or not, Marcus Aurelius relented, and he said, okay, if Asclepius wants you to stay here in Rome, then you should stay here in Rome. And he returned to the front without Galen. Instead, Galen was left behind in Rome, and he was in charge of the medical care of Marcus Aurelius's son and heir, Commodus. All right. So basically, he leaves him behind. He's like, okay, if you can't come with me, then you got to stay here and take care of my son. Also, he has the job of preparing the emperor's medications. So the emperor has medications that he takes daily, and it's the job of Galen to prepare these and send them up to the front so that the emperor will never be without his medication. And Marcus Aurelius does return to Rome in 176 AD, so about 6 or 7 years later. And Galen just becomes one of his personal physicians. He would later write that he was the only person able to treat and cure the emperor's chronic abdominal and chest pains. He had this special compound that he called the teriac that he would give him that apparently relieved the emperor had these like ongoing like chronic like probably like gastrointestinal diseases because they cause chest pains and abdominal pain and that kind of stuff. And whatever he gave him was able to cure that. So the plague, which is known to history as either the Antonine Plague, which is named after Marcus Aurelius' family name, Antonius, or the Plague of Galen. It's referred to as either, depending on which source you're reading. It is now believed, based on the descriptions largely provided by Galen and some of his contemporaries, that this was the first recorded outbreak of smallpox. This is generally agreed upon by most historians, and it's because of the descriptions that Galen provided, as well as other of his contemporaries provided about this. So patients were reported to present with a dark color rash that became rough and scabby if it didn't ulcerate. The ulcerations were both internal and external, so they were internal ulcerations as well. This is known to be, all of these are signs of smallpox. It was also coming with fever, vomiting, diarrhea, inflammation of the oral and nasal mucosa, cough, and ulceration of the throat. So, all of the hallmark symptoms, of smallpox. He also noticed that there were some patients that produced dark colored stools that usually indicates internal bleeding. They often died. Well, yeah, if you have internal bleeding, you're probably going to die pretty quickly. And then he also noticed that if they were going to survive, they would develop like a black rash over their bodies. It's important to know that Galen's description of the disease isn't considered to be complete. He really wasn't focused on the description so much as he was on how can I treat this, and he tried to find different ways to treat that. So while smallpox in relatively modern times was highly, highly fatal, the estimation that we have is that in this particular case, the Antonine Plague, about 7 to 10% of cases were fatal. Now, if you extrapolate that to the population of the Roman Empire during this time, that would likely mean the deaths of somewhere between 3.5 to 5 million people. There are some other historians, one of them by the name of Otto Seek, he was a German historian. He suggested that as many as half of the Roman population may have died during the epidemic, and that it had a particularly large impact on cities and armies when it was being spread, which makes sense, right? Higher population density, easier for it to spread. That's just basic epidemiology. The plague would subside finally in about 180 BC. So like this is a plague that lasts over a decade and just ravages the Roman army, the city of Rome, and other major municipalities. Interestingly, Marcus Aurelius would die in the year 180 BC from smallpox. And then it would go away, but 9 years later, a similar disease would ravage the city of Rome and continue for several more years. The one thing we're not sure of is we don't know if this was a new disease or if this was a recurrence of whatever caused the Antonine Plague. But estimates suggest that this plague was even worse than the first one. Galen reported that as many as 2,000 people were dying per day from this second plague that hit the city of Rome. That's how severe it was. Galen remained as the court physician through the reign of Commodus. So Marcus Aurelius passes the throne on to Commodus. He is actually assassinated in 192 AD. Galen stays on for the reign of Septimius Severus until he dies. Weirdly, the estimates of his death are either in 199, 204, or 211 AD, and that depends on what source is being referenced. So this guy, he like the plus minus on his death date is like 6 years in either direction, which is crazy. But he basically has this prolific life where he is in a position where he's just taking care of whoever the emperor is at that particular time. During this time, Galen carries on his experiments. He does all kinds of interesting things that provided us with a lot of interesting knowledge about how living things are connected, about basic biology, about even our biology. So to just give you an example, he was able to accurately describe the spinal cord and the vertebral column, as well as how they are connected to the central nervous system. He also identified the role that neurons play within the body. Here's one kind of cool experiment that he did, or a couple cool experiments that he did. Just a little bit of a trigger warning that he does things on live animals. One of the things he did is a series of experiments in pigs where he transected their spinal cord at different levels and then watched what happened. So one of the things you may know, if you know anything about like spinal cord injuries, the closer the vertebrae to the brain, the more damage it's going to do. So basically anything below that is going to be cut off. And as you descend your vertebral column, you in large part descend how the neurons are connected through your body, right? So as he worked his way up, he was learning how like various levels of the spinal cord transduce their messages throughout the body. Like if you cut here, the back legs don't work. If you cut here, the front and the back legs don't work. He learned he described the difference between motor and sensory neurons, like and how they contribute to our senses of touch, as well as how they're related to muscle tone. He gives us the term agonist and antagonist that we still use today as ways of triggering neuronal responses. He was also able to determine the roles that many different nerves had. So, for example, he was able to identify that the left recurrent laryngeal nerve is responsible for speech. So he did this through vivisections. He would take squealing pigs, and then he would basically cut the left recurrent laryngeal nerve, and the animal wouldn't be able to squeal anymore. He also did the same thing by tying off ureters to demonstrate how the kidneys and the bladder work together. Again, horrific experiments if you're doing them on live, unanesthetized animals. I mean, this is every definition of animal torture. But he's a man of his time, and he's just doing what he can do to understand how the bodies are connected. In the end, Galen would believe that the human body had three interconnected systems that allowed it to function, essentially. So the first system essentially consisted of the brain and the nerves. That first system, he theorized, was responsible for thought and sensation. That's actually pretty darn good. The second system he theorized was the heart and the arteries. So he believed this was responsible for providing life-giving energy. So again, kind of vague, but he's basically describing a cardiovascular system, which is kind of neat. And then the last theorized system were the liver and the veins. And he believed they were responsible for nutrition and for growth. So you can see he separated veins from arteries. So nope, those are part of the same thing. But interesting that he is able to understand like how the liver is connected through the veins, because the portal vein is what in fact connects the liver to the bloodstream. So that's how our nutrients get put in. So he recognizes that and says, yeah, this is responsible for nutrition. I mean, these are really solid observations from some pretty crude surgeries that he's doing to understand these. So very impressive what he's able to learn. He also, in his work, touches on the field of psychology. So it's a little too immature, I think, to call it psychotherapy, but he does believe that people who are older or wiser, and because, of his time, men, that they could provide counsel to people that were afflicted by psychological conditions, maybe even to cure them. Like basically he's like, have you tried talking about it to someone who might be able to help you? Like that's kind of what he's saying. And what was interesting is he also was one of the first people to really understand that sort of how our mental health and our physical health can be connected, which is really impressive. I mean, really way ahead of his time here. As Galen got older, more and more of his time was focused on writing, and he was a prolific writer. Okay, just to give you an idea, it is estimated that Galen may have produced more written works than any other author during antiquity. In so much so, his works, like what we have, we don't have everything that he's written, but what we have represents half of what remains of Greek literature. So like we've got ancient Greek literature, half of it's written by Galen. The other half is everybody else. Okay. It's possible, it's estimated that he may have written as many as 500 different treatises in his life that would have totaled somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 million words. That's crazy how much this guy wrote. He would write treatises about drugs and remedies that were used to treat disease and infection. So like literally like, hey, if you have a patient that's suffering from this, here's what you can make to help them. He also wrote a compendium of diagnostics and therapeutics. So like just basically like how to be a doctor. Like, hey, here's the things that you can look for in a patient that you think is suffering from this, and here's some ways that you can treat them. I mean, this is systematic medicine. That's what he's going after, right? So the downside to Galen, we have to remember where he came from. He's Roman. The Romans wrote in Latin, but Galen was from the Greek part of the Roman Empire. So Galen wrote everything that he wrote in Greek. And when the Western Empire collapses in the 5th century, essentially Galen is lost to Europe because most of the European scholars of the early Middle Ages could not read ancient Greek. But we get lucky. And we get really lucky because of the rise of 2 different civilizations, or at least 2 different cultures, would follow the collapse of the Roman Empire. The first is the Byzantine Empire, also known as the Eastern Roman Empire, that would be centered around Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. The other are the Islamic caliphates that would rise to power in the 7th century. Okay, this would become the Islamic Golden Age, and they were intensely dedicated to advancing the fields of science and technology. And they had access to Galen's work, and many Arabic scholars, many Islamic scholars, could speak Greek. So they were able to translate many of Galen's works into Arabic, which would thus preserve them for future generations. And eventually, Arabic would get translated into Latin starting in the 11th century. And this would begin serving as the basis for medical practices during that time. And it would also become the platform upon which modern medicine was constructed. So just understanding this, that Galen, this prolific Greco-Roman scholar, does all of this work, and we almost lose it forever after the collapse of the Roman Empire. But we're going to see how, in a few episodes, how the Byzantines stored this information, how they cultivated it, but also how the Islamic caliphates at that time not only took a lot of what the Greeks had and preserved it for us, but also built upon it by taking and infusing knowledge from the Eastern cultures, from India and places like that, taking that knowledge and building upon what the Greeks and the Romans had provided them. And then that's going to get fed back into Europe right around the time of the Enlightenment and trigger the European Enlightenment. As this information is shared, it's such an interesting story, and we're going to learn a lot about that in the next few episodes. Eventually, of course, many of Galen's theories about medicine, anatomy, physiology, they're going to get disproven or they're going to get improved upon. Okay, so for example, one of the Islamic scholars, a polymath named Ibn al-Nafis, would disprove Galen's understanding of the circulatory system because he discovers the concept of pulmonary circulation. He discovers like the lungs are way more involved than Galen told us. And he understands the movement of blood and gas exchange, but he's building off of Galen's understanding. He's taking his proposed circulatory system and building off of that, right? So future physicians are also going to use his approach to diagnosing patients. They're going to use observation. They're going to try to establish set therapies. They'll use dissection as a means of discovery to learn more about anatomy. So what you have with Galen is much like the ancient Greek philosophers that he was a descendant of. He brought forth ideas about how we should view the world, right? It was the ancient Greek philosophers that were bringing forth ideas about atoms and void, the relationship between Earth and other celestial bodies, the true nature of the universe. They inspired future philosophers to think about the world in different ways. Galen's ideas are going to do the same thing and inspire others to investigate medicine in a different way, to investigate how living things exist. He's going to inspire them to do this. And because of Galen's work, they're going into it with more knowledge than he had going in. And this is, literally just standing on the shoulders of those who came before you. He was passionate about medicine. He spent his entire life searching for a better understanding of how our bodies work, how to treat people that were afflicted by injuries, whether they were mental injuries, whether they were physical injuries. And while like some of the things that I talked about, they look outdated or ignorant or downright silly, understand that he was a disruptor. Like it took a lot of courage for him to go into a city like Rome. This guy that came from out in Turkey, who was just recently basically patching up gladiators, shows up and he's like, "You're all doing it wrong. All of you. You're doing this the wrong way." And I'm not afraid to stand up and say that. He did that. I mean, it takes guts to do that, and it's pretty awesome. Galen is often referred to as the father of systematic medicine. And the reason for that is pretty clear. The sheer volume of information that he produced, as well as the way he approached medicine as a field by assessing and organizing and diagnosing diseases, like that is really the kind of the beginning. It's not hard to see how that's the beginning of modern medicine, right? Like that is what doctors do to this day. And Galen's running around ancient Rome in the middle of two plagues, like trying to get people to do things the right way. So pretty impressive. So I'm super psyched that I got to introduce you to Galen today. I think he's a really interesting person, and I think it's pretty remarkable what he did. So I think it's great that that was my first episode back from a pretty long hiatus. I'm hoping to have more regular releases of these coming up over the summer, so stay tuned. I can already tell you that our next episode is going to be also about a single individual named Ptolemy. Ptolemy is to math and astronomy what Galen is to medicine. So, another very interesting story coming your way in the next episode, and I hope that you will tune in. So, it's great to be back. Thank you so much for listening. I'm hoping you're going to enjoy the new episodes that I'm putting out. If you have any questions or anything that you want to tell me about, you can email me thatbiodoc@gmail.com. You can also head over there to my YouTube channel if you want to see any of the videos that I have that I use for my courses. So if you're taking biology classes or just want to know more about biology, those videos are up there for you. So thank you again for listening, and I look forward to talking to you again very soon. Bye.